Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for logging in tonight, this morning, or during the day, whichever of those applies to you. It's great to see people logging in actually from all over the world, which is the real benefit of these online events. I'm just going to do some kind of admin, get us starting stuff while we have people that are still logging on. So I'm Katie Parker. I'm the Cartographic Collections Manager at the Royal Geographical Society, and I work closely with the Rumsey Map Center due to my previous position, which was as the research officer at Barry Lawrence Rudiman Antique Maps, who's a big supporter of the Rumsey Map Center at Stanford. So we'd like to start with a big thank you to the Rumsey Map Center for being our digital host for tonight's event. We appreciate, again, that they have the Zoom platform for this, but also that they did the admin with registration and things like that. So we're very, very thankful to Laura, to Stace, and to everyone there at the Rumsey Map Center. I am going to briefly introduce both of our wonderful guests this evening, and then we'll hand it over to both of them in turn to give a brief, about 20-minute presentation each, and then we'll move into, again, a 20 to 30-minute conversation discussion section where we will happily also include questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function down at the bottom, and I will try and tidy those up and integrate them into our discussion at the end. So today we have Elke Papelitzky and Sara Caputo. Sara is at Cambridge and Elke is at KU Leuven, which I'm sure I said terribly. Both of them are doing really interesting map research as part of their larger book projects and their larger research projects, both of which they can tell you about if they want to during their time. I know that Sara has a book coming out soon, and Elke has several interesting articles that are already out, both on the topic they're going to discuss tonight, but also on many other topics. So please do focus mostly on the route lines that we're talking about today, but if you have a burning question about something else they research, you can always try and sneak that into at the very end. So tonight, Elke is going to start us off, followed by Sara. So Elke, if you'd like to go ahead and start.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Katie. So let me share my screen. Okay, so you see here on the screen a Japanese map of Japan made in the early modern period, which is currently in the Rumsey Map Center. So I really wish we would be there in person and not via Zoom, so we could all stand around this beautiful object and look at it in person. But anyway, this is a map of Japan. You can see the main islands of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. It's a map on a 6-panel screen, so it's a pretty large map. But if we zoom into the detail, there's something really interesting going on there. And that are red lines that cross the ocean, that cross the waters of around the islands. And these red lines designate routes that we can find on a really broad range of Japanese maps made in Japan. Most of the time, they actually are red. Sometimes they're also printed and they're in black. But what I will discuss with you today, what I want to show you, are these red lines on not just Japanese maps, but East Asian maps more generally. So Japanese, Chinese, and Korean maps. And if we think about it, putting sailing routes on maps might be a somewhat strange thing to do. And so the sinologist Roderick Tuck, he has called sailing routes mental constructs. Because if we look at the infrastructure on land, if we look at roads, there's actually a physical equivalent that we have that we can map. But on the ocean, there is no infrastructure that really tells you the exact route. I mean, obviously, there are certain corridors that are preferred to be taken. There is infrastructure like lighthouses that guides the sailors. But this is kind of a different concept than what we have on land, where we can actually map a physical object. And that's why he's calling sailing routes mental constructs. And I want to discuss with you today how these early modern East Asian map makers, how they represented these mental constructs of sailing routes. And the very earliest map I am aware of that was made worldwide that shows routes over the sea is this map of Japan from the early 14th century. It's a manuscript that is currently at Nina Temple in Kyoto. And compared to the Ramsey map that I've showed you, it's flipped 180 degrees. So south is at the top on this map. But you can see very faintly that there are some very faint red lines that cross the archipelago, that go over Honshu. And in some section, these lines here, they connect the main island of Honshu with Shikoku, and over here that would be Kyushu. And unfortunately, the map is damaged here, but there should be a line connecting Honshu with Kyushu as well. And this is the very earliest extant map that I am aware of that does show sailing routes, or like routes over waters, connecting places. And on this map, it simply continues to connect the road network that we have on land and connects it to the other islands that belong to Japan. It's maybe not that surprising, given that Japan is an island country, so obviously connecting islands to each other is a very important thing to do for a country that consists of multiple islands. This idea of mapping routes on the Japanese archipelago continues in the century that follows. So in this map from Nina Temple, it's basically just one line each connecting the major islands. But then by the late 17th century, these lines become really ubiquitous. So here I have a map for you from the late 17th century by Ishikawa Ryusen, which is a very, very popular map of Japan of the time. It was printed in multiple editions. And this map was produced at a time when in Japan, we have a printing market really starts off. And Japan also had, in early modern Japan, also had a really strong market for maps. So this is a really popular map that a lot of people in the major cities in Japan would have been able to buy and consume and see. And if we look into detail of this map as well, there's a lot of lines that connect major harbors along the coast. And now on this 17th century map, it's not anymore just one line that continues the major road on the island and then continues on to Shikoku and Kyushu, but there's a real network of routes that cross the ocean, connect harbors even on a single island, and really just show you a very complete, a very comprehensive route network around the islands of Japan. And what this map also does is it adds here, there's little annotations on these route lines that tell you the distance between the harbors, between the places that are marked on the island. It tells you how far these places are from each other. And this is part of a bigger theme we can find on these early modern Japanese maps, and that is travel within Japan. We also find distances for land-based travel that are often in boxes around the shape of the islands. But in the case of the maritime routes, the distances are given directly next to the route. And in doing so, these maps allow the map reader to imagine travel these routes themselves, to imagine, oh, how far away are these places? They and sometimes even allow these people to concretely travel, to concretely go on pilgrimages. But in any case, so we have this future perspective that we can see in this network spanning Japan, spanning the islands of Japan, where people can imagine either actually going there or just imagining traveling across the network that spans the Japanese archipelago. This idea of annotated lines in the ocean is something we can also find on Chinese maps. And the maybe most well-known map to do that is the so-called Zhonghe map. Zhonghe was a eunuch who was sent in the early 15th century to the Indian Ocean by the Chinese emperor. He went there on 7 trips, and he went up to the east coast of Africa. And connected to this trip, we have this map. Unfortunately, we don't have a 15th century version of this map. We only know of it from 17th century, so we can't really tell if the routes and or the map in generally is a 15th century map, or to what degree is it a 15th century map. So I like to treat it as an early 17th century object, although other people might disagree and also draw back connections to the 15th century. But in any case, we have this map in an early 17th century book. And this map shows you the coast from southern China up to the east coast of Africa. And it draws the whole coast as like one single strip, as you can see above on the slide. And then within this map, we do have these dotted lines that show you connections between places. And these dotted lines are annotated here with a lot of very detailed information on how to sail. So these lines tell you how to use the compass, how long you take from one place to the other, and it also tells you about the position of stars to help you navigate. And the vocabulary used on this map is very, very close to seafaring knowledge we find in handbooks for sailors in rutters and other texts closely associated with sailors, where these texts instruct the sailors on how to get from one place to another. So here as well, we have a map that shows you a network across the Indian Ocean where there's annotations to these routes that help you, at least in theory, to sail again these routes. I'm not saying this map was ever actually practically used for sailing. I don't think it was, but the vocabulary that it uses and the ideas it alludes to show also this very future perspective of being able to sail again, or at least imagine to sail again these routes and just follow this route network across the Indian Ocean again. Annotating routes with compass bearings and distances and just generally showing a network is something we can find on even more Chinese maps. And here's an example of one that was made in the early 18th century, a map of Southeast Asia. And this map was given to the emperor at the time, the Kangxi emperor, to convince him that trade should be conducted. So the emperor at the time wanted to, or he restricted trade between China and Southeast Asia. But this map was supposed to show the emperor that there is a very important network of trade going on between southern China, between Xiamen and Southeast Asia. So these lines on this map represent this trading network that was going on from a Chinese perspective. So the Chinese trade between southern China and Southeast Asia, which was a very important trading network, and this map aims to show this network to convince the emperor to allow trade again. This is kind of in the Chinese and Japanese maps, these are kind of the functions we see from these sailing routes. So they show you a network of places that are connected. They show you the route network around Japan, around Southeast Asia, into the Indian Ocean. And they always try to show you, to give you a future perspective in how these routes might be traveled again in the future. And this is something we not and these routes don't only appear on maps of a smaller region of Japan or Southeast Asia, but from the 18th century onwards, we also have world maps that show these routes. And here are just two examples, one from Japan. This one was made in 1792 by Shiba Kokan, and another one made in 1800 in China by Zhuang Tingfu. And both these maps are two hemisphere maps that are that relate to European map making, to European maps, where both these authors, both these map makers took European maps and made, used them, adapted them, and made their own maps out of that. And if we look in detail, we can also see that both Shiba Kokan and Zhuang Tingfu's maps, they mark lines in the form of dotted, of dots, sailing routes. And very similar maps were made in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. Here's just one example, a late 17th century one. I could pick any, I just took this one by Pierre Mortier. There's a range of European two hemisphere maps that all have these sailing routes that, at least for my purposes, comparing the European and Chinese and Japanese maps, all have more or less the same routes. And if we look in detail, we find these sailing routes on these maps as well in the form of dotted lines. But if we compare them in detail, we will see that there's a major, well, maybe on the first glance, a minor difference, but in fact, it is a very major difference between the European and the East Asian maps. So the European map here, and most of the European world maps that have these sailing routes, they have little annotations here that tell you who sailed these routes. So here, for example, we have the route d'un savant pilote anglais. Here's the route of Magellan. So each of these routes is one past voyage. But if you look at the Japanese and Chinese maps, these annotations are gone. The information on the person who sailed the routes isn't there anymore. We can tell that the Japanese and Chinese map makers, that they used one of these European maps as their prototype, but then in the process of copying them, they decided to not copy the information on these routes. And this kind of makes sense. I mean, these European heroes, they're not necessarily interesting to the Japanese and Chinese audience, to the map makers, and Magellan is maybe not the most interesting person for them. But also, but in doing that and in removing the information on the past heroes, these maps bring the roots into the ideas that how Chinese and Japanese map makers understood these routes before. They understood these lines in the ocean as showing you a network, as something to be traveled again. So removing the names of the past brings these routes closer into the ideas of what routes should represent, of what these lines should represent on Chinese and Japanese maps. And these routes also connected China and Japan with the wider world. So if we look in detail on these lines, they connect to Japan, they connect to China, and then show you the whole network of a global connected world. When these maps, when these ideas of routes then traveled within Asia to Korea, the idea of the function of the lines kind of stayed the same. So I have here for you one Korean example of a map that was made in 1834. And the map maker, he's very explicit that he used Zhuang Tingfu's map as his prototype and then made his own map on that. And like Zhuang Tingfu's map, the routes are just dotted lines that are not annotated. And we can find a similar example in the case of the Japanese map of Japan that was that made its way to Korea. And the Korean map maker then when he saw a Japanese map of Japan, he copied the red lines and kept the annotations of the distances. Even though this person might not necessarily, the map maker and the map readers might not necessarily travel to Japan, but the routes stayed there, and the Korean map maker decided that the routes were important to keep them on the map. So within an East Asian context, the function of the route stays pretty stable. But if we take one of these Japanese maps, or most of these Japanese maps, and bring them into a European context, and when Europeans made their own versions of Japanese maps of Japan, the routes disappeared, the lines disappeared. And here's just one example of a map made in Augsburg that shows Japan. And if we look, there's the cartobibliography of European maps of Japan. There's not a single European map that copied these route lines, even though there's like the majority of Japanese maps of Japan has these route lines. So when the images travel from Japan to Europe, the routes get removed. So in conclusion, before I hand over to Sarah, I want to just point out again that I think marking routes on maps started in Asia, and then particularly in Japan, through the commercial map market, it was popularized a lot. So we find hardly any Japanese map of Japan that does not have routes on them. And the past heroes of the European route maps was not important. Instead, we have a future perspective. We have lines that show you, oh, you can travel there again. You can imagine to travel there again. And then from the mid-18th century onwards, these lines highlight that East Asia is connected in a global world. These lines show you a network of routes that not only connect China with Southeast Asia, but that connect China with the whole world across the Pacific. China is connected to the Americas. China is connected. The Qing Empire is connected to Africa, to Europe, to the whole globe. So in changing the function of the route compared to the European prototype maps, the Chinese and Japanese map makers draw maps that firmly place China and Japan into a global trading network, and they show, oh, we are part of the greater world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elke. That was fascinating, and I'm sure we'll carry over ideas we had from this talk in with Sarah. So Sarah, go ahead.
Right, let's see. This, and then once the bar disappears, I will go into presentation mode. There we go. Right, so, well, thank you very much, Elke. This was brilliant and a very, very hard act to follow. And so in the next few minutes, I'll look at the other side of the story and look more at European maps. For context, what follows is a bit of a sample of some things I developed in my forthcoming book, Tracks on the Ocean, which is just going to press with Profile Books. Shout out to them. So this is the work of quite a few years, really, and it's quite exciting to see it finally come to fruition. But even more exciting, I think, for me is to hear your comments and feedback. I've seen that in the audience, there are lots of people who know a lot about these things. I see that Jordana Dim is here. I've just come across a wonderful book. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to your comments. And another small disclaimer is that a lot of the maps and charts I work with are archival materials from places that are not very keen on me sharing the images without permission. So I've had to be a bit vanilla in the maps I put in here. If you think there should really be a map or a chart when I'm talking and there isn't, you're very right, and I'm sorry, and I'm sure you understand the predicament. So as a maritime historian, I'm actually going to start with a quote rather than a map. And this comes from the commentary on the law of prize and booty by Hugo Grotius, and most particularly from the chapter of it that was published in 1609 as the pamphlet Mare Liberum. So in this passage, Grotius made a very apt point. If, he says, the Portuguese describe as occupancy the acts of navigating at an earlier date than other peoples and of more or less opening the way, what contention could be more absurd? For there is no part of the sea upon which someone has not been the first to enter, so that it would necessarily follow from such a contention that every navigable region had been occupied by some voyager. Thus, we should be excluded from all parts of the sea. Indeed, it would even be necessary to admit that the earliest circumnavigators of the globe had acquired for themselves the whole ocean. But no one is ignorant of the fact that a ship sailing over the sea no more leaves behind itself a legal right than it leaves a permanent track. So here, Grotius was citing a famous passage of the Bible, which had become a bit of a trope in the previous century. And I should also say that this is a much later modern translation. In the original, the word that Grotius uses for track is vestigium, which means trace. My argument is that this function, personal occupation of the otherwise unmarkable, is absolutely key to the development of the track line in the West. And I also believe for this reason that the sea is the central pillar of this story, and more specifically, the colonial overseas activities of Western European states from the late 15th century onwards. And this is the core point of my book. So you can already see some themes that quite fit quite well with what Elke has just said. So as you know, there is a large debate over whether the European and Mediterranean ancient world actually used maps, especially for wayfinding. And for many scholars, again, some of whom might be in the audience, the itinerary vision, the term normally used, actually prevailed. So itineraries being textual or verbal lists of stops and landmarks. We do have a couple of ancient maps that seem to replicate itineraries visually, but I am especially interested in showing you what happens when in those maps we get to the sea. So here we have a quick look at what happens before ship tracks. And the first map I wanted to discuss here is the so-called Dura Europus shield. It's a fragment of parchment that once covered a soldier's parade shield. It was found in the ruins of the Roman Parthian garrison, known as Dura Europus, which is in present-day Syria. And this fragment has been dated to around 200 AD. So the bit that we see here in blue on the left is the Black Sea, and the red part is a bit of the territory of what today is Ukraine. And on the right as well, you can see very faintly in white a list of stops, itinerary stops, with little brick buildings next to them, just sketched. So classical scholars like Bennett Solway, Franz Cumont, for example, who have studied this map in depth, have pointed out that this could have been either a land or a maritime itinerary. But because it isn't represented graphically as such, we don't know. There is no line. That white line that you see is the coastline, and there are also a couple of ships you can probably just about spot in the water, but there is no track line, if this was indeed a maritime journey. This other example, I'm sure you're familiar with. This is the Tabula Peutoringiana, which is probably the most famous itinerary map from the ancient world. It's believed to be of Roman imperial origin, but the copy that we do have is like early modern, effectively medieval, and then transmitted in the early modern period. And Emily Albo has suggested that the archetype too may have been Carolingian, so not exactly Roman. I should say that the images I have on this slide are not the 1200 original copy that we have, but the Conrad Miller copy from the 19th century. Again, I don't have permission to share the original one, that's the main reason, but the features that I'm going to discuss are the same in this facsimile. So Catherine Delano Smith has rightly observed that these red lines are not roads, but routes, so itineraries. but they remain impersonal. They aren't attached to individuals or to a specific instance of travel. Again, what Elke was discussing earlier. But most important for us here, you may note what happens when these lines reach the sea. They just drown in. These two are zoomed in details of the coastlines of Italy. So on the left, you have the bit of sea between Campania and Sicily. Obviously, the tabula is not a map in a modern sense. It squashes the lands, but you see there in Campania, the line just ends. And on the right, similarly, on the other side of Italy, that's the end of Apulia, and the red line just disappears on the shore. And even when we come to very short river and gulf crossings, if sometimes even just a ford, the lines are carried on, but clearly just for graphic convenience. And they are really faint when they get onto the water. Again, this happens in the original as well. Their ink just gets drowned by this bluish water. This is the Nile Delta, by the way, as you will have guessed. And even more strikingly, coastal itineraries are represented in a very interesting way. So we're back to Sicily, and look on the left coastline, you have a red itinerary going around it. Again, here we have this conundrum. Is this on land or at sea? We don't know, but there aren't any sea passages across the map. And again, Bennett Solway points out that there are quite a few tracks which must have been maritime itineraries, because we know that the land passage in those parts is impractical or even impracticable. And Solway suggests that these lines were drawn as land rather than sea routes, perhaps because the artist was working from a written itinerary list and didn't realize that the instructions at that point were sending the voyager by sea. But I actually wonder whether there isn't another explanation here. What if the person who drew the table simply couldn't see a line on the water as making sense? So either way, the result is that the sea looks like this solid no-go space, like the floor is lava, the journeys end there. And this is the same thing that, to my knowledge, happens in later itinerary maps as we proceed into the Middle Ages. So again, as I said, this is a medieval copy, but maps that were originally made in the Middle Ages. So for example, Matthew Paris's famous itinerary maps, I told you it would be quite vanilla in my choices, which shows the imaginary path to the Holy Land. And the journey path goes straight from England across Europe and down to the tip of Italy. Here it is on the top left. And there the line ends. And then the map offers written instructions that you can see very small there on the left on how to proceed on the water in the itinerary tradition. So textual, they say keep Sicily to your left, Malta to the right, then you get to Crete, and so on and so forth. But there's no line. And a map of the Holy Land follows, normally bound next to this, and scholars have debated whether it was intended as a direct continuation of the itinerary or whether it was a separate map. And the very fact that we're wondering about this shows us how much of a caesura the sea was, a place where the journey wasn't represented. It's just a very strong break. And the aversion to drawing paths on the water, I should say, is even clearer in another copy of this map, which is also at the British Library. I don't have an image for you, where the channel is just a blue bar that cuts the route in two. The route stops, blue bar, and the route resumes. So essentially, it looks like this very notion of building journey lines on water wasn't contemplated. Instead, the line on the water comes into being properly in the West, at least, in the early 16th century. Baptista Agnesi's atlas maps of the journey to and from the Moluccas are often cited as the earliest examples, but we do actually have some globes from the 1520s that already show Magellan's route, his track, and quite possibly an engraving of the travels of Alvise Cadamosto and Pedro da Sintra, which are in an edition of a compendium of Portuguese journeys. But again, we don't know when this specific edition was published or whether the map belongs to it originally. René Tebel has a really brilliant discussion of this in his thesis. Again, no image, sorry. In any case, the origin of Western tracks, whether it's Magellan, whether it's other voyages around this period, it's almost startlingly sudden. And in my view, it stems from three distinct roots. One is the vague shape of land roads and routes. Some like the ones that we saw are actual physical roads, but I don't think that we should give them undue weight for the reasons I've just discussed. The sea is quite different. In addition to the Tabula Petriniana, we do have quite a few, well, a handful of road as opposed to route maps on land, of course, from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is the Turin Papyrus. It shows the Wadi Hammamat and the roads, well, kind of routes, but more like roads surrounding, like leading to this mining region. And then you see the Wadi running at the bottom. But I believe that, and I know that others who worked on journey lines very much agree, roads are quite different. They're a different kettle of fish. They're fixed features of a territory. They're not human experience. And most of all, the sea is just a different medium from land, because you can't really fix things at sea. The precedents of shipping lanes, so-called, became established very early on with European overseas expansion. Lauren Benton has discussed this quite thoroughly in her model of a tubular sea. And of course, this is the legal debate on the territorialization of oceanic spaces in which Grotius was intervening. But road maps might be part of tracks ancestry, yet not their main branch, in my view, precisely for these reasons. The sea is watery, and roads on sea don't exist until this specific point in time when a lot else is happening. And what else is happening? This is the second and very, very important route of Western tracks. In my view, it's East Asian cartography. And as Elke has just brilliantly shown us, not only were there sea routes on Asian maps and charts much earlier than in Europe, but this tradition was actually quite developed. And on my part, I have found some circumstantial evidence of transmission from Southeast Asian to Portuguese mapping in the 1510s. I'm happy to discuss it later. We don't really have time to go into the detail here. But in any case, it's certainly significant that the very first European sea routes appear very shortly after European shipping enters the Indian Ocean. And that is an interesting chronology, precisely because they appear in relation to these oceanic voyages. In any case, as she has just pointed out, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean tracks are quite different from Western tracks because they show sea roads, as we said, like the fixed future potential and networks, effectively. So not these personal individual journeys. And I remember when we first discussed it with Elke, it was actually quite exciting that we realized that we've reached this conclusion from opposite ends. And the conclusion is that the subjectivity of the track is basically a Western innovation. So here we come to the third and I think decisive route of modern Western journey lines, and that is sea charts. So as you will know, none of the surviving so-called portolan charts were likely to have been used at sea, but quite a convincing case has been made for the existence of practices of pricking a course or apuntar, so by pricking little holes in the vellum or using droplets of wax. And this very concrete practical activity is at the origin of the notion that you build a journey as you go along. On land or when coasting, you don't need to build a journey because landmarks and descriptions are more than sufficient to guide you. And that's what the itinerary, the textual and verbal itineraries do. They use what's there. But on the open seas, there's nothing there. And so that line is your lifeline. And here, I think, is where we see the significance of oceanic exploration. What changed specifically in the 15th and 16th century? Obviously, as you know, any line on a map or a chart is a fiction, a filling in of space between fixed points. And when the track is dotted, of course, this is often an artistic or technical choice, but I believe it also reflects the track's construction, these discrete fixed points, one by one. In a sense, and I think this is what allows us to consider tracks across very different forms of mapping, because their origin, which is partly within the realm of charting, actively underpins their transfer onto other types of representation, like geographical maps. And that is because the track reflects the process of its creation. So what are the unique uses of a journey line that marks this process, and in so doing individual movement? Storytelling, of course, but there are also some uses that are very directly imbricated with European imperial activities. And the first use is what I have hinted at the start, occupation, and making territorial claims and priority claims. These tracks are like urine trails. They say, I've been here, and in some cases, and in some ways, I remain here. This function is not served particularly well in 16th century maps like Magellan's, and it only develops slowly. So when we have multiple copies of early maritime journey maps, the track actually varies in shape. These are two different copies of Agnès' Planisphere. The one on the left is from Munich, and the one on the right is from the Biblioteca Nacional de España. And I have highlighted there these two islands in the Pacific, the Tiburones and Sao Paulo, which, well, haven't really been identified with certainty. But anyway, if you look at the track isn't quite sure where it went in relation to them. And I've seen many copies do either thing, either going below, going between, and there are copies that go above, like, for example, the Turin version goes above. So this track is not making any concrete occupation in any sense. What I could here launch into a discussion of why this is. There's a matter of secrecy at the time. There's a matter of intention. What was the function of this map? It wasn't necessarily to precisely pinpoint where they were going. And there's a whole heated question of a medium, whether manuscript is more unstable and less replicable than print. But suffice it to say that by the late 18th century instead, European explorers and hydrographers are actually well equipped to mark the sea in this way, and they do. Tracks become key to discourses of accuracy and discovery. So I have an article on this coming out soon in the English Historical Review, and this is something of what I discussed there. We see it in the very language deployed in exploration accounts. Past tracks are discussed as features of the landscape, of the seascape, I should say, in relation to which seafarers adjust their position. And these here are a few quotes out of many that I could have picked. These come from George Vancouver's account of his voyage in 1791 to 95. And you see that he's talking about the courses of his predecessors as things in reference to which he moves. So he says, we passed about 15 leagues to the northwestward of the Resolution's track in the year 1778. It's not like the Resolution's track is actually there on the sea, but it becomes present virtually through this. And here we come to a second use of a track in the West, which is data collection. And here I follow Richard Sorensen in his consideration of a track as one of Latour's immobile mobiles. The personal quality of trust and the embodied quality of instrumental procedure, which are much discussed by historians of science as typical features of modern Western science, are, I think, perfectly reflected in the track and in the way in which it's deployed by 18th and 19th century hydrographers and surveyors. So hydrographical manuals from this period often recommended procedures of dotting the track and the mapped coastline in bad weather. So hydrographical charts make careful statements substantiated by evidence. And in all this, the track marks the observer's presence and point of view, as well as the limits of both. So here is the legend from the front page of Matthew Flinders' Atlas that kind of represents his track during his circumnavigation of Australia in 1802-3. And he's telling us exactly what he did as he was doing this survey and uses the track for that. So which winds he encountered where, the stretches that he covered at night or in very thick weather, so when he couldn't be sure of what he was doing, and how he completed each position measurement and so on. Without a personal track record, all of this wouldn't be possible. And here, briefly, you can see in practice what it looks like on his chart. So the dotted bits where he wasn't entirely sure, and then you can see some TKs here and there that show when he timed by chronometer, basically, that's what it means. So the final function of an individual track, which is also deeply entangled with Western modernity, is surveillance. This use of the term tracking that we have become particularly familiar with over the last few years, I should say. And this too, I argue, begins at sea, and more specifically in the requirements that are established by European navies in the 19th century in particular, that a track chart should flank the logbook as submitted evidence of each journey. Now, I have an article out for review on this, and there are many, many maps and charts in particular of courts-martial, for example, that I could have shown you here, but I'm afraid I don't have the permission or the time. So I'll refer you to the book. This is chapter 5. So to conclude, I think that Western track lines are quite unlike Asian ones, and they only look like land routes. Their ancestry is slightly different, but is most importantly bound up in the subjective personal marking of territory and achievement that they uniquely acquire on the pathless sea. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. And that carried on just perfectly from Elke's paper. So I think we can obviously see how they mesh together. And it is very exciting that both of you ended up with some common ground, starting with very different sources and entirely different kind of goals with the scope of your research. So that's always exciting to hear, and I'm sure was very reassuring for both of you, actually. So I'm going to just start with a few questions and then pepper in or trying to include some that we have in the Q&A. Some of them are very specific in the Q&A about references and things, so I'm going to actually leave those till the very end, and if we don't have time for them, we'll keep them and I'll pass them on to the speakers. We're going to go until roughly about 10 to 15 after, just so people can, can know how long we're going to keep you captive here. And we appreciate those that have stayed so long. So in terms of both of these sets of maps as sources, to what extent should we be considering them alongside texts? Both of you talked about things like itineraries and rudders and things like that. So to what extent, in order to kind of fully read this map, do you think that we need to also be bringing in other textual or manuscript sources, or perhaps even other maps? Just kind of, are these to be read as standalone objects, or do you think that they are part of kind of a larger textual world about navigation in these contexts?
Okay, I will start. I think it really depends on if you're talking of Japan or China. So I would say in Japan, they're very much standalone. And these maps were supposed to stand alone. I mean, we do have related textual itineraries as well, but I think the maps themselves were also supposed to stand alone. And in China, these are often much closer connected to the text. So we have a map. So for example, we have a Chinese map that shows a route, and then the pages following it, there's a very clear description of what is going on this one particular map. So I would say we have both, depending on time and the context and the object.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for the ancient maps, it's almost like the text is there even more preponderantly than the maps themselves, to the extent that the itinerary dominates. And the itinerary maps that we have seem derived from these itineraries, and they are very much discussed in this way. For the more modern period, so sometimes we have very little by way of text with which to discuss these maps, and we don't really know that much about them. I've been doing quite a lot of digging on Battista Agnese, and we don't know much about him at all, but we have all of these copies of his atlases. So sometimes you can't really put them in a textual context specifically, or in a way that you can be sure there is a relationship. But much of the material I work with is actually naval charts. And in that case, I think it's indispensable to put them in conversation with the text, because they were designed to accompany the text both as reports to immediate superiors, and then, as you they're very well catered because you are the world expert on this, when they were published, in the way in which they were in dialogue with the printed account. And so, yes, I find it really interesting, and particularly coming to this as a maritime historian and a historian of like archival manuscripts from my previous project, I'm very, very interested in embedding the maps into the historiography on all sorts of other things that were going on at the time, and seeing how there is a strong connection and how we can learn from both sides, basically. And yeah, I think maritime historians ignore charts too much, generally speaking.
I agree with that. And as someone who also came at maps through a maritime and a naval history lens, I was really struck by the examples you were using at the end, particularly Vancouver and Flinders, of the performativity with which they were including kind of their own soundings and survey lines, but then also doing a self-referential thing. So it's definitely has to do with subjectivity and performativity and kind of this front-facing self where they know they need to act a certain way in these voyage accounts and present all of their information in a certain way so that they will be taken seriously, not only by the Admiralty, but also by this really specialized readership that has been honed over the last 200 years to expect very specific things from these voyage accounts. So I think the discussions you had about readership are really tantalizing. And so a question for both of you is about, and this is kind of unfair to Elke, but do we have more discussions about readership and how these things might have been used, particularly in the East Asian context? Do we have discussions about these networks and what is the best way to show them or things like that? So do we have kind of examples of use? And I'm thinking specifically of a lot of the examples I've seen of kind of copies of maps that were in the voyage accounts that have route lines on them that then someone has taken the time to very precisely trace or to draw on their own, even as a school exercise. So kind of this desire to replicate them in manuscript from something that's either a printed or a well circulated manuscript object. So is that happening? I know that's happening in the European context. I'm not sure so much if it's happening in the East Asian.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to what degree do the people reflect on putting the lines on the map? And I'm actually not aware of much discussion. I've never I wish I had. It would be really great. The only thing I remember
Readership
having
is so difficult.
Yeah, but it would be really cool if we saw some Chinese mapmaker reflecting on the routes. Yeah. But the only thing I can think of now is that there's a preface to a Korean map where it says, okay, we have the lines and they are red. So where it specifically says it's in a printed book. Even the book is in black and white, but the preface of the book says there are lines over water and they're supposed to be red. And that's the only instance of somebody in writing reflecting on these lines that I'm aware of. There might be others, but they're not very, not in your face. So there might be like hidden references somewhere, but not in discussions where everybody knows that they're there.
Definitely. Yeah, go on, Sarah. Go.
No, okay.
And adding in, I guess, another wrinkle about references to this, Jordana Dim just, she had to run, she's very sorry. But she would like to kind of bring in the idea of, because several of the questions are asking about the lack of continuity, it seems, between land and then sea routes, and that there does seem to be some hesitancy about crossing into the water. So first of all, Vera Dirafeva-Litrin had a question about, do we, in the East Asian maps, but I guess this could be a question for European maps as well, do we see, even in the later period, any kind of routes that are doing that? And if so, are they using different colors? So do we have yellow in the land kind of as an example, and then it switches to red? Or if they do go land to sea, are they just a continuous color and line? And then just as another wrinkle of perhaps a place that might be part of this origin story, Jordana brings up for land and sea routes of the case of Children of Israel / Exodus. So kind of in those historical maps that are showing kind of biblical lenses on things, that might be something that's worth thinking about or bringing into the discussion.
Yeah, I never thought so much about the continuity, but it's a very good question, Vera. I think in the later maps, so 17th century onwards, I think there's no continuity anymore like we had in the 14th century Japanese map. I think that kind of vanishes, but I'm not going to claim that it doesn't happen anymore at all because I never looked at it into detail.
No, fair enough.
So most of the bulk of what I'm looking at is charts in a Western context from when lines begin to appear in the sea, and maps that were once charts, if we can call them that they're kind of taken from technical charts and then kind of translated for a broader audience. They tend to be squarely about the maritime journey. But what I have found is there are some conventions as to how to depict different types of journey. So for example, in the 19th century, British naval officers are told that they have to, when they use steam, the track has to go in red, because they are encouraged to not use steam unless it's really necessary, because it's logistically a nightmare if you deplete your coal, etc., etc. And so on their track charts, then suddenly the track becomes red when you go under steam. And actually, this is a practice that ends up being translated across Europe, because I have this lovely chart by two Italian trainee cadets from a newly established Italian Navy that has the same. So they have this convention that they have to switch to steam, and they get trained to do that, to mark it in a different way in this spirit of self-tracking. But so in terms of a difference between land and sea, I can't think of anything off the top of my mind, other than those pointing a table things where like they go onto water, but that's not the point, and so they kind of fade into it. And in terms of the Exodus, I was just thinking, so one of the things I look at is John Moxon's various maps of various biblical journeys, and he does have, for example, St. Paul's journey to Rome. So he does have maritime routes. Hiram dragging his little logs to build, Solomon's temple, like the logs that come from Hiram, and they get dragged along. But yes, the crossing of the Red Sea is a really fascinating one. And I have recently read Jordana Dim's book, and I think she's really persuasive in her case for the Exodus being the very earliest journey that actually gets represented on land. So I suppose the crossing of the Red Sea is a bit of a cheating, because as she says, it is land at that point. And so maybe that's why they are less reluctant to depict it before the vogue for maritime journeys actually comes in. So that's a really good point.
No, that's true. I hadn't thought about it being in that context. It would be land. So there we go. No, that works. That works. And I definitely wrote the floor is lava very large in my notes. So clearly I took away the important parts of this. So again, bringing up something that Vera Dorfey-Lichtman has brought up with particularly the distances we saw on the East Asian maps. To what extent are those symbolic? Because it is not, and every voyage is going to be different. And we've definitely heard of Japanese voyages, even just normal fishing voyages, that set out and then get caught in a hurricane and end up going, to forever and away. So to what extent are those kind of symbolic? Which leads me into a larger question actually about, in general, the scale of these maps, because they're all kind of regional or above in terms of the degree of resolution we have. And that regionality actually seems really important to the East Asian context, because drawing these networks, they're not just kind of intra-Japanese networks, they all are kind of going outward a bit. So to what degree perhaps are these symbolic of kind of some kind of regional identity? And then moving into a later period where we show them globally, to what extent is that regionality being either challenged or reinforced by a larger global interaction?
Okay, yeah. So about the degree of like how accurate these distance lines markers are. For Japan, I never checked how much the numbers make sense. So they use like miles, so very broad distance. I never checked that. In the Chinese context, they use a time unit. So they say, so they don't give a distance per se, but they tell you how long you're supposed to sail. And if you compare that to the rudders, so the sailing handbooks, the numbers match more or less. So they seem to be numbers that make sense for the Japanese context. I never checked. And regarding the regionalities, so I kind of cheated in not showing you any there are city maps of Nagasaki with route lines. So I only started with Japan. So I only had 20 minutes. So so in Japan, we do have the lines on basically any kind of map that shows the coast. It's like if it's regional, like if it's one province, if it's a city, it's mostly just Nagasaki as far as I'm aware of, because of its maritime connections.
Sure.
And then it goes up to the whole world. So I think in the Chinese context, the connecting with Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean is very important for their view in the world. In China, we also see a shift. The first maps with routes, they connect China with the Indian Ocean, and then from the 18th century onwards, they focus more on the Philippines and more on the eastern side of Southeast Asia, with some shifts in trading networks and the importance of trade that kind of gets reflected in the maps. And then I think really the world maps come up at a time when the world gets even more globally connected, and then they're just like a step behind and reflecting the more global connections that appear.
Sarah, did you want to come in on that at all, or?
Yeah, well, just to say that I guess particularly with charts, the question of the regional, it's very interesting, because if you it depends on what you focus on, and the more detail you have, the resolution of a map allows you to track what the officer did and make a survey more precise, I suppose. So if you zoom in, and that is kind of the reason behind the choices, I think, both on the original manuscript charts and then what gets printed in the accounts. So I guess it's a functional more than a symbolic reason for what is represented.
Makes sense. And we do need to remember, these are in large part, there is function to these. So there's a lot of method behind what is there, not just in terms of the routes. The routes are an integrated part of the map as a whole, or the chart as it case may be. I'm going to combine a couple questions, one from Matthew Edney and one from Vera. So Vera asks about, maybe it's not from Vera, maybe I'm totally making that up. That's fine. It's also partially from me, so there we go. So Matthew is asking about, oh no, it's from Michelle. So Michelle asks about that, and I think you actually answered this in the talk, Elke, about that, yes, in those later examples, we do see some of the routes on a European map being brought into the Japanese map, but that's where they're leaching out the names. But that's in later examples that you showed us. I think 18th century examples. So then building on that, Matthew asks that after 1768, European world maps and globes generally kind of replace all earlier routes with those of James Cook. And so whereas we used to have kind of 8 or 9 routes, once Cook goes, especially once we get all 3 Cook voyages, you're much more likely to see just the 3 Cook lines. Do we see something similar happening with Japanese maps? So are they also going to be updating for these European routes, or even other maybe Japanese voyages that they found kind of more current, and then they're dropping previous networks? So are those networks changing over time, basically? And then winding that out for Sarah, that selection process is really interesting, and it's something I've noticed is highly nationalistic. So you'll see that Cook is kind of okay with everybody. A lot of people put Cook on, but then you also will often notice, particularly the French before Cook, will always want to put like the track of the St. Anton or a couple of other ones, just to kind of show they're like, oh, we were in the super South Atlantic as well, and we've gone across the Pacific at least twice. Don't have much information about those voyages, but we would like to include them to kind of show that it's not just kind of a British thing, or it's not just a Spanish thing. So to what extent is that selectivity process also kind of a part of that competitive subjectivity and kind of placing perhaps representation right there at the fore?
Okay, so my impression is that the Japanese and the Chinese, they each had one European map that they used as their source, and then they copied the routes from that one. And they did so the route lines are copied from this one European source, to answer Angela's question too, which I think you were referring to.
It was Angela, yeah.
So yeah, so they did take the European map and then copied it. And most of the maps do not have the Cook voyages yet, as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
But then there's in the early 19th century, there's a Japanese map by Takahashi Kageyasu, who does very explicitly take Cook voyages and starts mapping the two. I mean, Cook also kind of went past Japan, and that I think becomes kind of important. But that's something I haven't looked into too much into detail yet. But I think in the early 19th century, the Cook also appears on the maps. But then there are other maps that just kind of, especially in China, that just repeat the routes that they had taken in the 18th century from some map, and then just keep repeating the same routes, because these routes, the exact routes, don't have that much meaning to them because they don't have the names attached to them.
Mhm.
I think definitely, Katie, when these accounts are published, as you know, they are very nationalistic, unless they are publishing a translation of, like, I don't know, the Krusenstern expedition, and then you see the Russian tracks because the whole book is about that.
Right.
But in the maps that are meant to, in the maps of exploration, Cook does swipe everything and everyone off the board. When these other tracks are reported, I find it's often when there's something to criticize about them, when there's an explicit discussion of saying, well, they went there, but they didn't actually come here and find this, or sometimes, well, disprove it. So the tracks get swept off because, as you know, your works on this, some of these places appear and disappear. And so they kind of use as an excuse for getting rid of their predecessors, foreign predecessors' tracks, the fact that their landfalls are actually in the wrong place. And so they say, well, we went through here, this track that was followed by this Frenchman 50 years ago, and he said there was an island here. Look, we've gone here and the sea is empty. Right. So they kind of referred to in that sense, but definitely it becomes a matter of national competition. And then there's also the question of I guess because a lot of the earlier tracks are not deemed accurate enough to be worth putting on there, because they were by dead reckoning, most of them. And so once this obsession kicks in with like precision and accuracy of exactly where you've gone, and like take longitude measurements with all sorts of instruments and calculations that you can deploy, and then do it as precisely as you can, the other tracks suddenly kind of, they would in some ways poisoned the accuracy of the whole thing, because they're just estimates and hunches. Right. I guess
would undermine the overall presentation of the map as a separate thing, or the chart as the case may be.
No, I haven't found any explicit discussion of this, but I can't see Flinders putting a random unconfirmed track on his maps, right, and charts, right?
No, definitely. I'm going to leave off the last two, which are specific for Sara about Baptiste Agnesi and the differences between his maps, and then for Elke about the Zhonghua maps and their modern reprint. Both of those I'm going to pass on to our speakers, and they can email Vera about those separately. And then to Michelle, who I wrongly spoke of before, she asked for a citation that actually, when this goes up on the YouTube channel, that slide did have a citation to the Korean map. So it had the name of it and then the year and things. So that should be findable from the video when that's posted. So as a last question, I just want to kind of open it up for both speakers and say, personally, for your research or for the topic in general, are there other avenues that you are keen to follow or that you hope that someone else works on, either in terms of more research in more archives or something like that, or perhaps in more comparative studies? This has been really interesting to put East Asian and European maps in conversation. Should we be adding other regions or other types of mapping practices and charting practices? And that'll be our last kind of question here today.
Okay, I'll go first. Yes, definitely. I think this is a really interesting topic, and obviously Jordana Dim has worked on land journeys, and I think there is so much more to be discussed in terms of a specific fields in which the track establishes itself within especially European consciousness, and also how it gets transferred to other parts of the world where because tracks obviously in East Asia they were known and used in a certain way. In Europe they come into being and get used in another way, but then the European way in particular is now quite pervasive. It's like something that we use every day effectively. And so I would really like indigenous scholars to see if there's any record of this transmission, because it is a form of imperial imposition and kind of it's a cultural export, and that is what I would really like to read about. How do these lines get exported more broadly?
Excellent. Elke?
Yeah. For me, I think it's really the color. I mean, I mentioned red a lot, and I really wonder what's the meaning of mapping these lines in red. And I was talking about this to Richard Peck at some point. He was like, "Oh, I have a map that has blue lines," and that's a very weird map. I've never seen one with blue lines, or it's a Japanese map, and that's something I really wonder why is it always red, and then why is there this one blue line? And then Sara today also, she mentioned that with the steam on, they put the lines in red. So there's even more red color and these lines. So that's something I'd really wonder about. And then the relation between the routes on land and the routes at sea, and how do they relate to each other. And now that you've asked me today, Katie, I also really want to know, find Chinese and Japanese discussing them putting lines on maps. Now I'm going to search for some notes.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. If only we could find lots of discussions of our sources where people are like, "Dear diary, today I read, and this is what I thought about it." Thank you so much to both of our panelists. This was really stimulating and dynamic. So we really appreciate your time, your preparation, and you sharing your research with us. Just for people who are wanting more, this is going to become one of the new forum features in Imago Mundi. It will be out in the second issue for this year, which is volume 75. So if you want more, please do make sure that your subscription to Imago Mundi is updated. And remember, you can get a discounted subscription to Imago Mundi by joining ISHMAP, which is the International Society for the History of the Map. We also really want to have a big thank you to the Rumsey Map Center at Stanford. They are going through a period of exciting transition, but that makes planning events all the harder, and they were our champions throughout, so we really, really appreciate their support. A lot of the maps you saw today did come from their collection, so I highly recommend going online and seeing all of the great digitization work they have been doing, but also check out the other events that they do have coming up. There's always something very exciting happening, and usually it is available online. This recording will go up on their YouTube channel in good time once the editing has been done and all of that. And otherwise, we thank you so much for joining us this evening, this day, and this morning, wherever you are. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for listening. Have a great night, everybody.